Long term, my dream is that we do have a harmonized world standard. You have to start somewhere. So we've been working more specifically with the UK to kind of start the discussions there. Some of that is because of shared English language. But if you figure it out there, can then you figure out in two more places, in one more place, and grow it from there.
Hello and welcome to our latest podcast episode. My name is Elisabeth Skoda. I'll be your host today. So it was recently announced that 60% of US households are now able to recycle cold to-go cups made from polypropylene curbside or through drop-off programs. And this was made possible by a collaboration of a wide range of stakeholders, including recyclers and brand owners, including Starbucks. And this was led by How to Recycle. And today I'm very pleased to welcome Paul Nowak, who is Executive Director at GreenBlue, which is the organization behind How to Recycle. And I should add that GreenBlue are also content partners of Packaging Europe's Sustainable Packaging Summit. So we've been working with them for several years now. So it's great to have you on the podcast today, Paul, and get your insights today.
I'm so happy you invited me. Good to see you, Elizabeth. Love all the things you guys are working on to share knowledge in this world of sustainability and packaging.
Lovely, thank you. And likewise. So as a sort of introduction, any listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the organization or with yourself indeed, could you tell me a bit more about yourself and GreenBlue and How to Recycle?
I get lots of practice with this. So I'm Paul Nowak, and the Executive Director of GreenBlue. Been in the packaging space for about 35 years. Grew up in the converter side of the space, so folding cartons, pressure-sensitive labels, stretch and flexibles, and worked my way much more into the R&D problem-solving side of packaging probably about 15 years ago. And what I found was many of the R&D projects had a component that were clearly sustainability, even though they weren't calling it sustainability at the time. And slowly that has changed, that almost every R&D project is now considering sustainability. So about 4 years ago, I was offered the position to come over and be the executive director of GreenBlue, and have been excited to be leading the org. So I would not be surprised if not everyone has heard of GreenBlue. GreenBlue is a nonprofit organization that's member-based. We've been around for about 25 years. And really what it started as was a bunch of stakeholders, what we would call members, that could be across all of circularity. So if you think of all the different stakeholders in circularity, we have retailer members, brand members, converter members, material manufacturers, recyclers. And oftentimes they're working so focused just in their own area, they can't see the whole picture of all the stakeholders. So this GreenBlue came together to really give them a space to educate each other on best practices, to be able to see what other people were working on so that they could prepare for it, so on and so forth. And so GreenBlue is the overarching nonprofit. What you most likely have heard of are some of our member programs. So the largest one is the Sustainable Packaging Coalition, or SPC. We have about 600 members in the Sustainable Packaging Coalition that covers all of those different stakeholders I just discussed. And they work in working groups on specific problem statements like consumer behavior change. If we have a recycling rate of X, how do we move that up? In cases even where we have access, right? The recycling rate can still be much lower than we'd like it to be. So all the different working groups under SPC are where members can come together, work on a problem statement, and then put education forward to the rest of the membership and the industry that drives us all together. We recognize that sustainability is such a team sport, as we would call it. You really do need to have everyone off the bench playing together. And so to give them a space to be able to do that around really specific, actionable problem statements has bore fruit for us. The other program that you mentioned, the How to Recycle program, has been around since 2012. And I just talked about how SPC has working groups. It was not called How to Recycle. It started at SPC with a problem statement. Isn't it crazy that we don't have consistent on-pack disposal instructions in the US and Canada? And a bunch of members coming together to form it. And that was in 2012. Started slow. I will tell you, we have now 800 brand members using the How to Recycle label. So as a disposal instruction, How to Recycle, really what we do is we offer an education and a point of truth on a voluntary basis where a member can share their packaging material information with us, and we can give them a label designation of what we feel the proper consumer education for disposal instructions is. Started very small, but up to 800 members now, so very widely recognized in the US. We took a lot of inspiration from OPRL in the UK, so have a really strong relationship with them, love the work that we're seeing coming out of the UK on their end. And then as we look at extended producer responsibility in Europe, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later in the conversation, how do we start to harmonize there? So the work isn't done with How to Recycle, it's really evolving.
Yes, like you said, we're going to delve a bit deeper into sort of learnings and collaborations across the pond later. But before that, obviously, like I said in my introduction, it was recently announced that 60% of US households are now able to recycle polypropylene cups. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, prior to reaching that milestone, what was the starting point you were working with before you got to that?
That's a really, I think, interesting, hopeful story. So that's probably 4 to 5 years in the making. So this isn't something that happens overnight. The stakeholders that we worked with had been working on it and did a large part of the lift before we even got overly involved. So those stakeholders would be the recycling partnership, the closed loop partners with their next gen project, waste management, which is one of the large material haulers and MRFs in the world, and then certain brand members. The one that was specifically focused on here was Starbucks and their work with us. And so in the last, I would say, year and a half, we really, How to Recycle and our team really came in as they got closer to this threshold. So for those who may not know, in the Green Guides in the US, which is managed by the FTC or the Federal Trade Commission, the one data point that they really talk about is this 60% access number, that to be able to claim something as recyclable on pack, it should reach 60%. There's lots of nuance to what that means. And the way we look at it is really, does a consumer understand that they do have access to this by they're being implicitly told by their municipalities, whether it be on a website or a flyer or education, that this is available. So all these groups work together first to prove that a waste manager wanted these types of materials and that they would be made into something different. And then started to look at the municipalities and were they actually communicating this to their citizens to say, these are available in your area. And what was really interesting is they found this gap, which is probably not a big surprise, that polypropylene cold cups were wanted, but in many municipalities, they had not updated their acceptance lists so that the consumer knew or the citizen knew that these were available. So there's this group project where all those stakeholders I mentioned started to go municipality. In some cases, waste management would manage that list, but in others, the municipality manages it. So it can be a ground game of like really going place to place to see where it is. And that really, you started to have this large increase then of accessibility because there was always access, but we were not communicating it properly to the citizens to say there was access. And I think what's even more exciting to me about this is once we've uncovered this, we're now working on where can we repeat this? Where are there other materials? Obviously, there's some materials that possibly would not fit in this stream and maybe a recycler wouldn't want, or there isn't a strong end market on. But for the ones that are, is part of why we're missing gathering this many materials, just because of this barrier to communication or miscommunication to the citizen.
I wanted to dig a bit deeper into the collaborative process that was behind this result. Obviously, you've talked about it a little bit as well, but I'm keen to hear about how the different players played their part.
So if you think about the different players, if Starbucks is the brand, obviously they're using this material in this form in a cold cup, and they're very interested in doing all the right things for the environment to make sure these materials are being reused and recycled. So their platform to be able to help us have that discussion with municipalities was really important. Waste management had the boots on the ground as a collector to be able to say, yes, we do want these materials, but yet we recognize we're not clearly educating on them. The closed loop partners and recycling partnership go even deeper, I would say, than waste management, because they have programs including grants for municipalities where they're literally talking to the city and local governments about what's recyclable, what's not. And when it isn't, is it just a question of we need new bins, or is it a question of we need a new flyer? And they're very good at that type of communication because that's what they do. The recycling partnership also keeps up a municipal database of what's recyclable and what's not. So that gave us a really actionable tracking mechanism, or a KPI, to be able to track to see it go up or go down as we're making these changes, because they track what's being listed in the municipalities. So you could watch the number week by week. So we met weekly for over a year, just saying, like, is this having an impact? Isn't it having an impact? And we continue to meet because we don't want to stop here. We want to get that number even higher.
That leads nicely to my next question. I was curious to find out what the next steps are now that you've reached this goal.
I think two. One specifically for polypropylene cups, like I was stating, 60% should be the bottom of the bar. And how do you get it to 70? How do you get to 80? So specifically to polypropylene, some of the communities that we reached out to were what I'd call large hits. So a population density that would move the number up in a higher rate when you're tracking by percent. So there's still many medium to smaller communities that this same type of thinking and the same work could be applied to. So the same team is now starting to chunk through those, like, what's this one? What's this one? On top of that, when you think about repeating this with other materials, paper cups for Starbucks and for others that use a hot paper cup have an even lower rate, and arguably are being taken every day already in many forms. So taking this and then tweaking it for another material and another group is our next challenge. So we're looking through, like, how do you get paper cups to a certain rate? It probably won't go to widely recyclable right away. So in the how to recycle methodology, we have not yet recyclable, check locally, and widely recyclable. Widely recyclable is at 60% or above, and that's just access. It still does have to have sortation. It still does have to have an end market, all those other things. The reason we have check locally is there's this whole group of like 20% or higher that in large areas could have access for a consumer or a citizen, but are not quite to that 60%. And our belief is able to get to the 60%, the on-pack communication is critical to that. So if it's going to go from like not yet recyclable, which would be your 20% or lower, to widely, that's a big gap. How do you start to get consumers there? It becomes almost a chicken or egg conversation if they don't know that it might be recyclable. So what we've been working through on the paper cup is getting it over the 20% and into a higher rate, so it gets to at least check locally, so we can start communicating to consumers. And one of the things, and this is me pontificating just a bit, I think you have to have a very tight, short, actionable game, but also a long goal horizon. And so you're really doing both of those. And the naysayers, my joke is, We have a number of people who are saying, well, we're going to be devil advocates here. Devil's got plenty of help, doesn't need your help. But we don't need to focus on that. So like the long game and the short game, the long game of like, how do we get this to widely? How do we use these in new materials, new forms of packaging is always there. But then this short actionable game is, I think, where people get stuck in like analysis paralysis of, well, if it doesn't get all the way here, why are you doing that work? Because you have to do those chunks to get there. And so what this group is doing is really doing the work. It's like weekly meetings. What are the numbers? What communities are doing it? Are we messaging it right? Should we reach out to different partners to work with? So I think once these stakeholders came together and saw the power of what this could do, there's a hunger now to apply this to other forms of materials and packaging. Paper's the next one for us, but it could keep going from there.
Yes, it makes total sense to sort of keep going with small steps towards a bigger goal and not lose sight of the big picture. I was also curious, obviously you aim for these recycling rates, but do you also work towards 60% are actually being recycled? Because I guess being theoretically recyclable and actually being recycled, unfortunately, still there's a gap between the two, isn't there?
Yep. Yeah, we do. And I would say that's not necessarily the goal of this stakeholder group, but GreenBlue and many of the groups I mentioned have other projects to work in that area. And it really, again, does become that chicken or the egg discussion of, if you don't talk about the possibility of it being recycled, can it be recycled? So one thing we work on is this idea of like, what's technically recyclable? So it means the technology is there and it could be recycled versus is it being recycled? And there's a big gap even between those two things. And so there are cases, if you look at, we're talking about access to recycling at the beginning. Now we're talking about an actual recycling rate. There are materials, certain fiber materials that are highly understood as recyclable, have high access, have a strong end market, that still can go 30 to 40% of them actually being recycled. So what we feel you have to do is, if you can prove that there is an appetite and the ability to recycle it, so that technical recycling and the end market, we should still work towards calling it recyclable in some form, and then look to the consumer education piece, where GreenBlue has been very active with our How to Recycle on Pack disposal instruction, is to start to look at what is the behavior change needed for these items that are understood to be highly recyclable, but we're not getting the materials from the consumers. And I'm very careful, because I think some people in the space, like, it's almost like blaming the consumer. And I don't believe that that's the right path. People are very busy. We work in this every day, so we can't expect everyone to be packaging nerds like I am and really dig into this. So what we're working towards is, on pack, we're telling them something, but we've done nothing else to connect that messaging to like global education. So one of the things we have is a program called How to Recycle Forward. And it's really talking about a 3-year, multi-year national campaign that takes the brand equity of what's on pack, that has been 800 brands using since 2012, and then now connects it to in-store messaging, advertising, long-term messaging to connect those dots. And I think when you look at it that way, and you think like, well, why aren't consumers doing this behavior? We've never done this. We've literally never consistently, year over year, told them a consistent message around, here's what's recyclable, here's what's not, or at least look here, in a way that works for them. Not like as an engineer, not as a sustainability guru, but as like a marketer saying, really, this is where you're at. So what we've been focused on for a year or so is we hired an agency for How to Recycle. They've developed this campaign for us, and it gets much more into the, don't talk even about recyclability necessarily, but meet the consumer where they are with messaging that works for them. We'll be piloting and testing that later this year, because obviously you want to pilot and test before you go nationally with it. But we think there's really an opportunity here to move those numbers up if we can be consistent in what we're saying to the consumers.
Yeah, that sounds like a good way forward for sure. Yeah, I wanted to zoom out a bit towards GreenBlue's wider work and look at the current situation in the US around EPR and recycled content and recyclability regulation. And I understand it's more done on a different state basis there. And yeah, I just wanted to ask you for an update or run up of what's happening there at the moment.
I would love to. I'll start by saying we're not lawyers. So what I'll tell you is, as someone who works very deeply and GreenBlue works very deeply in the industry, and also one of the things about GreenBlue and SBC and H2R, our programs, we don't lobby. So many associations do that. That's a function. But for us, we're much more seen as a point of truth, where if a state needs a data point or needs some of our work to help them make these decisions. So extended producer responsibility, you rightfully said, is a state-to-state initiative currently. It is not happening at the federal level in the US. And there's some pluses and minuses to that. And I think when I'm in Europe, I hear some of this across the different countries or the different areas, even in the UK, when you think about, there's sovereignty to be able to do what you want, but also in a national scheme that can make it difficult for a consumer to understand something. So currently we have 7 states in the US that have extended producer responsibility laws, and some of them also have forms of truth in labeling laws, which can impact what you're allowed to say is recyclable. And really, this extended producer responsibility system, which isn't new to the world, has reached a critical mass, because when there was one state, it could kind of be looked at by a producer as, yes, we'll comply, but is it going to change our world? When you get to 7 states, where like 1 in 6 consumers are possibly in a state that has an extended producer responsibility law, it gets a little different. Overall, we do believe, for some of the challenges we talked about early in this conversation, that policy is an amazing tool to move forward, to fund building infrastructure for some of these materials that are going to landfills or going to other places in the wild that aren't good. So we absolutely believe it's an important tool, when created correctly, that it can harmonize and work together. What I've said many times is I believe we're in the messy middle right now. So they were being created, and I think people were watching them, and now they're being implemented. So we have multiple states that have implemented them. One of the states in the US that is in implementation is California. And because California is just so populous and has such a large GDP, I think all the states are important, but many people have been focused on California. If you're a producer, just looking at the numbers of products you would send into a state. So that's another thing that has kind of shifted the energy around it. What we are seeing is, and this is me just personally editorializing what I've seen more change in the last few years because of this policy than I probably have seen in the majority of my 35 years. So slowly, as these have come closer and closer to due dates, you're seeing people like, oh, we were working on these projects, we got to take them even more seriously, or we have to up the timeframes. That's good, but also can create a messiness and a friction in the systems. So what I've said to everyone, do the work. Like we talked about earlier, have your long-term goal, have your short-term goal. Don't worry about the things that are out of your control. But short-term, what do you have to do today? Focus on that. Because it's very easy to get sucked into the, analysis paralysis of like, what's this all mean? And where's this going to go? And if it's the right thing and it's already mission-based for you to be working on initiatives around sustainable packaging, that doesn't change. And the business imperative of it has just moved up. There was always a business imperative in my mind, but now that has a whole different way, look and feel. The other, I think, really kind of intriguing thing, when you think of a brand or a converter and their organizational chart, it has brought in players from that org chart that normally would not be in these types of meetings, like your CFO or your head of regulatory. Because this was always voluntary, it was generally housed in specific areas of an organization. And the other areas kind of heard about it, but they didn't have to be as engaged. Now you're seeing engagement from these different groups, which we personally love. When you talk about a nonprofit that is bringing stakeholders together, the more talent you have in the room, the more unique thinking you have in the room, the better these long-term solutions are going to be. But that's something I think we knew, but now that we're seeing people show up with these different skill sets, and it's moving from voluntary to just like, this is what we have to do, and we're going to fold it into our normal compliance systems. It's a very different personality or archetype of a personality and how they think. That's been, I think, it really taken some of our members time to let that soak in because it's shifted their organization.
Yes, that sounds really encouraging, actually, especially in the context of my next question, which is obviously on a federal level. It seems like in the US, sustainable packaging has faced some headwinds and all sorts of different challenges. And yeah, I wanted to get your take there. How optimistic are you that sustainability efforts will continue to move in the right direction in the country?
Yeah, I would say I am very optimistic, and it's much more based on what I'm seeing happen at the member level and the brand level and the converter level. So what has happened is there's a certain amount of green hushing where they're not going to talk as vocally about what they're working on. But because we have the privilege of being close to our members, the work is all still happening. I haven't seen anyone stop the projects. I've seen people accelerate the projects. There's probably not going to be the flashy press release around it. But they're still working on it, because what I said earlier is they're seeing the business imperative of it now through a different lens. And I believe it was always there, but this has been made very clear to them by the possibility of a fee schedule for extended producer responsibility. So to me, the horse is out of the stable. Like they're not going to just all of a sudden pull back. Long term, of course, I think it would be better in the US if we did have some harmonization at the federal level. But businesses many times have led the ways on these initiatives, and then you get the catch up on the other side. It can, sometimes it is more top-down policy first. Sometimes it is the businesses reach a critical mass and a crescendo, and then they work with their representation, and then you see it become policy. I believe you'll see the second half of like the businesses will do the work. It'll start to make such good sense as things move through and they see funding and that these systems can work, that then you'll get federal recognition. But that could never happen, and you could still have all the good work. But most likely, if it goes where we're seeing it go, the businesses will not stop moving forward the projects they've already worked on.
Again, yeah, that's very encouraging to hear. Very pleased to hear that. I wanted to wrap up our conversation today and get your take about on the importance of cross-country collaboration as well. And do you think there's anything the US could learn from Europe or indeed other countries or continents across the world, and maybe vice versa? Is there anything that we could learn here in Europe from how things are done in the US?
Yeah, I mean, we have events. GreenBlue comes to different parts of Europe. So we'll be in Vienna this summer with UNIDO, so the development organization for the UN, and the WPO, the World Packaging Organization. I do feel like there's so much we can learn, and this problem has an urgency to it that us not learning from each other or not sharing work is counter to the mission to move quicker and move forward. So one really interesting thing that we just started working on, and for how to recycle and the discussion of like flexible films and the struggles that we've seen all over the world with coming up with good working streams, waste streams for these to be recycled. we've really been watching PPWR and what they've been putting out and talking to a European about that. And so they shared with us the iconography they're going to use for a flexible. We're in the midst of creating something for how to recycle that needs iconography for flexible. So we've said, should we just use that? And we're going to end up using that. So now you have Canada, because our program does go into Canadian label and US and possibly areas of Europe starting to use the same iconography. That might seem small to a brand that's putting this on billions of packages. That's a big win. Mm-hmm. So I do think like some of the things we're working on, people are surprised that they haven't been done yet. Another project that what we've learned from Europe is to look at some of their test methodologies that, remember we talked earlier about technical recyclability versus it being recycled. So technical recyclability often is based on and should be based on data and science, not an opinion. And so Europe in some cases with paper and plastics has developed really good test methodologies to use for that. There are certain ones in the US as well. Maybe we should all be using the same one, or at least have reciprocity with each other to say, we recognize yours if it comes in. That moves the mission forward faster. So we're not saying we have to do a whole nother test method because it doesn't fit in Europe, or we have to do a whole nother test method because it doesn't fit in the US. So those are, other than like the big fun things you talk about when we go back and forth, I go back to like short-term, long-term. There's some really easy short-term wins that have big payouts if you do them. So that we've learned much of that from Europe. I think for us, the reverse has been the US seems to be more hyper-focused on the consumer and consumer education. And part of it is because of the way EPR has started state to state, and it isn't federal. And what you're seeing in Europe is much, I would say, not quite a mandate, but it's a much more forceful language coming top down. We've started more from the consumer piece with the businesses to say, if you do all this and the consumer doesn't participate, doesn't matter. And so what we've been doing is sharing how behavioral studies work. We've been using QR codes that are focused on the consumer, whereas in Europe, they've been using watermarks more in the recycling process. So sharing data about like how a watermark or QR code works differently from a consumer standpoint and a technical standpoint. So that's just 3 examples off the top of my head of like someone has really good work or data, don't repeat it, don't spend the money on it. If it fits you and it's still culturally relevant, you can now move faster because you have that piece already. So does that save 6 months from a project? Sometimes that saves a couple of years from a project. Those are all important when you're looking at the timelines we're on. So there's so much we can learn from one another. Long-term, my dream is that we do have a harmonized world standard. You have to start somewhere. So we've been working more specifically with the UK to kind of start the discussions there. Some of that is because of shared English language. But if you figure it out there, can then you figure out in 2 more places, in 1 more place, and grow it from there. So it's kind of how much time do you have to work on it? But there's so many opportunities for us to move the mission faster if we work together.
Absolutely, yeah, and that sounds like a no-brainer in an age of obviously international trade to have universal standards. Absolutely, that would be the dream. So hopefully, we can work towards that. Great, thank you, Paul. Yeah, that brings us to the end of today's conversation. It was really great to hear from you and to speak to you. Thank you very much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, so appreciate it. Hopefully this inspires some people to take on that next project and get things moving, because that's how this all happened with polypropylene cups.
Absolutely, yes. And if you want to see more of GreenBlue, they'll also be at Packaging Europe's Sustainable Packaging Summit, which again this year takes place in Utrecht in the Netherlands from November 10th to November 12th. So we look forward to seeing as many as you as possible there. Thanks very much for listening, and goodbye.